and just kind of review the workspace that we have going on here because this to some people this might be a bit of an unfamiliar program. You can see that a lot of the interface is graphical. There's not a whole lot of words on things unless you hover over them and wait for that little tooltip, and then it sort of gives you a little bit of a description. There's not a whole lot of documentation on 123D design yet, and I'm sure that's because there's a lot of changes going on. So if need be, I'll be sort of updating these tutorials as we go on because this will be a bit of a long-term project for us. But we'll start with the simple stuff. So you can see down here we have two options called snap and units. Now one slightly confusing thing about 123D design is that they use the word snap to refer to two different kind of concepts. And one, I'll show you what this controls. The snap, as far as these numbers here go, it basically decides when the software is going to try to start and stop the movement of the objects that you're placing based on this grid here. So if we keep a snap of 1 and we're working in millimeter units, what that'll do if you have it on, as you can see as I move the cube around here, it snaps to those little grid lines, and that can be pretty helpful for keeping your object, in a certain alignment and keeping those measurements flush. So I'll show you what happens when we try to move an object while snap is set to 1. I'm going to go ahead and select my object, and I'll talk more about this little movement dialog here. But right now, just watch the measurement dialog right here where my cursor is. Right now it's 0 millimeters, but once we start moving it, we'll see it moves 1 millimeter to the left, 2, 3. It snaps to those multiples. If I set snap to 5 and start moving it, you'll see that it moves in multiples of 5 millimeters. 5, 10, 15. You can also make those into fractions of millimeters, or whatever units you choose to use. You can edit the units that the grid is subdivided by into centimeters and inches, and it'll keep the size of it'll automatically convert the size of the object to the new measurement. Now, if you're a Pikes Peak Library District patron and you're doing this mostly to get some 3D prints going, I recommend you design in millimeters or design in inches and then convert to millimeters at the end. The reason is that STL files, they save the numbers of the measurements which your object's dimensions are recorded in, but they don't actually save the unit. So if you create a cube that's 10 inches long and 5 inches wide, when you load it into the 3D printer software, the 3D printer software is only going to recognize the 5 and the 10, not the inches, and it's not going to automatically convert. So your object will come out, a fraction of the size. It'll be 5 millimeters wide by 10 inches long or something like that. So I recommend we stick with millimeters, but that is one thing that you can do here. Up here we have our familiar undo and redo keys. So if we click that, it's going to undo the movement of the cube that we did before. I'll talk a little bit about the navigation controls for this window because moving around in 3D can be a little bit wonky. The first thing is, okay, so you have your left click on your mouse, and left click selects an object, and that's pretty simple. If you have two objects, you are going to left click and then drag it. You create that selection marquee, and it's going to select all the objects. Now the selection marquee, you don't have to fully enclose the object to select it. And I did that there, but you can actually, it'll select anything that it barely touches. You can see I'm going to select both cubes, but I'm not going to wrap around both of them. You'll see both cubes got selected there. If you left click an object and you hold down the left click, you're going to end up sliding that object around. And it'll slide around on the grid that you've got it set to at the moment. Now here's how you select subparts of a solid. So your subparts are faces, edges, and vertices. We're going to click the solid, and just a normal left click. We're going to move the mouse away. And then we're going to move the mouse back on, and you'll see that it allows me to select any of the faces around the solid, or if I move it toward an edge, I can select just this edge. or I can select a vertex, plural vertices, and that's just one little point in the corner here. And something to keep in mind is that when you select a solid object, you'll see this little menu pop up down here. These are different things that we can do with solids. If I select a face, you'll see that little gear comes up, and it gives me a couple of options that apply just to editing faces. So we can tweak them, we can press and pull them, and we can shell them. We'll talk about that a little later. If I select an edge, I'll get that gear, and these are different. These are tweak, fillet, and chamfer. And if I select a vertex, I'll get just tweak, because that's pretty much the only thing you can do with a corner piece there. Anytime you need to unselect an object, you just click out here in the blank space, and the object will be unselected. Now, as far as moving around the screen, you can right-click and hold the mouse to rotate the camera, like that. You can hold down the middle mouse button to pan the camera around. So I'm holding down the middle mouse right now. It's just moving me up and down while keeping the same angle that I'm viewing at things from. And of course you can roll your mouse wheel up or down to zoom in and out. If you want, some people prefer to move using this little view cube up here. And what you do with the view cube is if I hit this right now, it's going to just adjust me to look at it straight from the front. And then I can move it to a corner, move it to another face. I can hit this and move it to the top so I get a straight down view, bird's eye view there. I'm going to go back to, you can also hit little corners. Go back to the front, and in all this moving around, I basically got twisted sideways. So there's another option. If I click one of these little arrows on the side here, it's just going to roll me over. Oh, sorry if getting vertigo there. And the little house button's going to take you to it's always just going to take you to the front left view a little bit from the top. And then there are two modes in which you can view your work area. Right now you're looking at it from perspective view, and let me give you an idea of what perspective view does. So I'll put some shapes out here, and they're at different distances, and if I hit it straight from the front, you can see that the cone is smaller than the cubes, and so is the sphere, and because they're farther away, that's how human eyes are used to looking at things. But sometimes when you're designing, you want things to you want to be able to get a real sense of what the actual measurements of these things are relative to each other without regard to how far away they are. So down here in the little drop-down menu under the view cube, you can set it to orthographic. Right now we're in perspective, and if I set it to orthographic, it's going to look a little bit less natural when we're just looking at it from an angle, but if we switch it to the front view, you can see all of these objects were actually the same height all along, but you didn't get that impression, or you weren't too sure about it when you're looking at it from the perspective view. So if you pan around, you can look at it from a different arrangement. Of course, you won't see the cube behind there very well, but you can see that they're actually all the same height. I prefer to work in perspective view unless we are trying to make some fine adjustments to the dimensions of things. So down here you have, or over here on the right, you have a couple of options. And what these do is, if you don't have, a middle mouse button, or if you just prefer to use the left click most of the time, if you hit the pan button, then for your next left click, instead of selecting things or doing the usual left click functions, the camera is going to pan around just as if you had held down the middle mouse button. And basically orbit does the same thing. It lets you orbit around a certain point just as if you were holding down the right mouse button. I think there's a little bit more precision because you can target the point of orbit, whereas if you just hold down the right click like this, nope, they work pretty much the same way. Alright, so if I hit zoom, it's going to do the same thing as if I rolled the mouse wheel. So basically it's like this. You could theoretically, I guess, control this whole program with a single mouse button, but that sounds unnecessarily tedious. Alright, the rest of the options on your right toolbar, fit, is basically going to give you a camera angle that captures every object that you have on the grid on your screen. Basically zooms you in as close as possible while still giving you a decent view. The materials and outlines toggle basically controls how you want to view the objects here. I think I've removed the outlines. Here this just creates outlines only so I can see through the objects. I do prefer to work seeing both the materials and the outlines. This lets you hide and show some different, so meshes are your solids, and sketches are going to be the two-dimensional things that we're going to work on in part 2 of the class. But if I hide them, it's going to just, like I said, just going to hide them, and you're not going to be able to see them, and then you can show them to bring everything back up. Now this can be useful because there is a hide function to hide individual solids. So if I click a cube and hide it, and next time I want to bring that back, I'm going to want to go over here and show all. Basically, it'll bring everything that was hidden back into view. There's no real good way to just bring things back into view one at a time. It's pretty much everything is you know, all the things you've hidden are hidden, or you bring them all back up again. And then grid visibility, of course, just turns off whether or not you see the grid of the workspace that you're working on here. Up here we have a couple of tools. Over here on the transform is your move and rotate and your scale tool. This is your primitives button where you're going to be able to place different pre-made shapes and sketches. This is the sketch menu. Again, we'll talk about that in part 2 of the class. The construct menu where you have your extrude, sweep, revolve, and loft buttons. Again, this is probably more for part 2. Under the modify button, we're going to find different tools to modify our solids, and most of these come up in the contextual menus that I showed you before, those little gears that come up when you select a face, edge, or vertex, but this is another way to navigate to them. Patterns we'll talk a little bit about later, but they basically create arrangements of shapes in either rectangles or circles or a path that you define on your own. We'll talk about grouping later on. Combine lets you merge shapes together or subtract them from each other or just create parts where they intersect. This is your text tool. Snap will bring objects together according to their faces, if you choose to snap faces to each other like that. Again, we'll go into that a little bit more detail. This is your measuring tool to measure distances between vertexes and edges and faces and things like that. And then your materials tool can choose the colors that the cubes appear in. Again, we'll be covering those tools in more detail throughout the rest of the tutorials, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what this whole space that you're looking at over here. And of course, you have your file menu on the top left. You can open up a new file. You can insert STLs that you've already worked with before, or I think .objs also work. Import SVG. We'll talk about that in part 2. Of course, you can save to your computer, and you can also save to the cloud. Now, this is going to save a document in a proprietary 123D file. Export to STL is what you want to use to finalize your 3D model for 3D printing. I haven't messed around too much with the actual 3D printing option there. We have our own software here at PPLD that we use to prepare it and load it up into our 3D printers. So those are all of the options that you have available to you, and if you'll join us for the next video, we'll cover how to use all the different tools here. So see you then.